Glue is literally the thing that holds our projects together. But if you look at any big box store or any woodworker's catalog, you're almost overwhelmed by the number of choices. So let me go through and kind of explain how these work and give you a better idea of what glue is appropriate for what projects. As we start on the side here, the first three are called Pva glues, so the normal woodworker's glue. In this case, we have an interior glue used mainly just for indoors. We have a water-resistant glue that can be used for indoors and out as long as the project isn't submersed. And then finally, we have a water-based but waterproof glue. And again, those are all in the water-based glue category. The next, we have hide glue. You don't see it used as much anymore, but that is definitely one of the choices that you'll have. Next, we have polyurethane glue, totally different type of glue, and we'll explain what that is. And then we have some epoxies. In this case, we have a small 5-minute epoxy. It's in this, looks like an injector type system. It has equal amounts or appropriate amounts of hardener and resin in it. Here we have that same epoxy. It's not pre-mixed. And we're going to show you in a minute how you mix those two together in the proportions that you use. And then finally, instant CA adhesive that's used for a multiple number of things. And again, we'll go over that too. In general, if we decide to separate out these glues by their function, we can say that if the projects are going to be used indoors and kept from weather, all of these work. If the projects are going to be used in very high humidities or in areas where there is very much humidity fluctuations, I would probably eliminate the interior glue and also the hide glue. The rest of these would be fine. And for projects that are used outdoors, in areas where maybe they'll be immersed in water, though not totally submersed for long periods of time, you can use the water-based waterproof glue, you can use the polyurethane glues, and also the epoxy glues. They all work very well in those elements. In general, all these glues work about the same way. There's some variances, and we'll review that. But in general, any time that you're planning on putting material together, the edges have to be machined well. They have to meet well with no major gaps in them and be clean and dry and free of grease and oil. So let's start with the water-based glues and work our way through and give you some application tips. Well, let's talk first about those PVA glues. Whenever we do some joinery, want to make sure again that the edges are perfect square and 90 degrees to each other, that the space between these joints is negligible. In fact, with only hand pressure, we don't see any light coming through, so I don't need an awful lot of clamping pressure. And they're clean and dry and free of any grease or oil. When I'm putting the glue on, I like to put it on just one edge, like this. And I'll spread that glue with my finger, like so. And then to put it onto the opposite piece, I'm just going to rub those edges together. And what it does, it provides a nice even glue line across the face. I set them in the clamps. Firm up the pressure first and just make sure that the edges meet well. And start by getting just a little bit of tension on them. All they really need is a half turn, maybe 3/4 of a turn. There's no need to provide excessive pressure. Remember when I laid those out before the glue was on there, you couldn't see through that seam. There's no reason to put excessive pressure on there, which will only tend to warp or bow that wood, maybe even dent the corners of it. What you should see when the glue's been applied correctly is all but individual beads of glue on the top of this board and also on the bottom. You don't want excessive glue swaying all over the place, and usually that comes from putting it on both sides. This actually works really well. Now these are going to stay clamped in this particular case for about a half an hour, and clamp time always depends on the temperature and humidity. The warmer and drier it is, the less clamp time, the cooler and more moist it is, a little bit more clamp time. But about a half an hour is right. Check the manufacturer's recommendations on the label and you'll see what we're talking about. Here's where the question comes in, as always, especially when working with regular PVA type glues. When do I remove that squeeze out? There's two options. My particular favorite is to just take a damp rag, and I always keep a bucket of water next to my bench. Keep a damp rag and rub that squeeze out off both the top and the bottom of the glue up. That way I know I've removed the glue. I'm not terribly worried at all about it affecting the glue line, because it won't, and it also won't affect the joint strength at all. It actually works really well. So now what we have is a nice clean line. It'll dry beautifully, a light sanding, and a finish will be perfect. Second option is to let that glue dry to what I consider a popcorn consistency. So it's not too hard and it's not too soft. And then you can use a scraper like this or even a razor knife with that razor blade. And you're going to pull across the top of that when, again, the glue is in this state where it'll come right off the top without being so dry it actually pulls slivers out of there, which would be very hard to try and fix. Or if it's wet inside, you're literally scraping it into the pores, which will cause a problem. So using regular interior glue is really easy. Make sure that your edges are machined well, they fit well, minimal clamp pressure, individual beads of glue on the top and bottom, and in my case, wash that off before you go too much further. You'll have a perfect glue joint. You'll never have a problem with any of the finishes that go on top of that. And the next glue is hide glue. And as I mentioned before, you don't see this used as much as it used to be years ago. In days of old, hide glue was in powder form and it was mixed. And it was kept warm in the equivalent of a crock pot and used by woodworkers to assemble pieces that would ultimately be disassembled or could be an old piece of furniture, and also to settle down or glue out pieces of veneer. It can be still used for those purposes now in repair, especially for those people that want to preserve an old antique piece of furniture or repair pieces of veneer. But that's about the use of hide glue as you see it by most woodworkers today. Now, polyurethane is next up, and it's a really kind of a unique glue, mainly used for outdoor projects. It has the ability to be waterproof in almost any situation in all but burial conditions. The difference is that polyurethane works a lot differently in its action than does the regular PVA glues or even the hide glue we talked about just a minute ago. Polyurethane cures by presence of moisture. And what you find in most other glues is that the surfaces have to be really dry. In polyurethane, you actually need to wet these just a bit for them to work. Second thing is that as polyurethane cures, it has a tendency to foam. And that foam is extremely sticky, kind of like stepping on gum on a hot summer day. And if you get it on your fingers, it'll turn your fingers black. So normally when I use polyurethane, I like to wear rubber gloves, and that solves that problem. And the last thing is polyurethane's clamp time is a lot more prolonged than it would be if we were using regular woodworker's glue. Clamp time on most polyurethanes is between 2 and 4 hours. And again, so you have to be prepared to have something clamped up that long. What we'll do is apply this so you get a chance to see what it's like, and then we'll talk about the foam out issues after that. So the first thing is, I've got my pieces here, and they're machined well. And it is something that I have to add, I guess. One of the misconceptions about polyurethane, because it does foam, that it will fill gaps in poor joinery and provide for a much stronger joint. And the fact is that's not really true. Though it will fill those gaps, the extra space it takes up is just glue, and glue on glue isn't strong at all. So the idea is the joinery still has to be tight, and this glue will work real well. So don't let a real sloppy joint be the focus when you're using polyurethane glues. They need to fit just as well as anything else does. The way that I wet these is with a brush, and I know you can do it with a damp rag. Brush with a little bit of water works well for me, and I just spread it on one surface like this. And I'll take the polyurethane and apply it on the other. And the other thing is, apply about 1/3 less polyurethane than you normally would with regular PVA type glue. The expansion will be great, and you'll have it all over the place if you put as much as you normally use with regular woodworker's glue. So we're just going to put 2 strands on here, and you'll see it'll be more than enough for what we're doing. So it mates right on the face of that wet surface, something that most people would find a little bit strange when you're dealing with glues, but it does help that glue set up. Now we'll let these clamps sit on here for a bit, and you'll see the foam out that comes from them. One more thing about polyurethane glue is that it cures in the presence of moisture, so I would suggest that when you store it upside down. Any air or moisture in that air that gets in this container will now rise to the top, and any potential hardening will happen here, which will still allow you to get glue out of the front. If it's left straight up like this, any of that air up in here may form a nice hard layer down in this spot, which will keep you from being able to use that glue. I also found good practice is to buy as small a container of polyurethane glue as you can. You always feel like you're going to use a lot of this. You're using a lot less than you do regular glue. Anything that you don't use over time will be wasted because it's just going to harden in the container anyway. So smaller container is a better bet. Now this glue has been sitting out about an hour or so, and to give you a pretty good idea of what to expect when using polyurethane glue. This is a foam out that I talked about before. After an hour or so, it's pretty hard. It still probably should cure for the next couple of hours or so. If this were bent lamination, it would take a little bit longer than that. But the idea is that I didn't touch it beforehand. I don't have to worry about it now. There's nothing on my fingers. And to clean it off is as simple as taking a razor knife and taking it off with a razor knife, or is using a scraper like this to do the same thing. If this were made wider than you need, which is normally the case, then take it on your table saw or band saw or scroll saw. You can trim right through that. It won't hurt those tools, and it leaves a nice clean edge. Polyurethane is a great glue. It works really well as long as you adhere it well. Pieces mate well. They've been wetted down with a little bit of water and clamped for the prescribed amount of time. This is what you'll get out of it. It's a great adhesive. Our next adhesives are epoxies, and we've got them in two forms. One is 5-minute epoxy. It's in a syringe type container, and it contains proportionate amounts of hardener and resin. And when you squirt down the plungers here, you get those little mixes, and we'll show you how those work. And then secondly, we have the containers of both hardener and resin separately, and you'll mix them separately. We'll show what each one of those is used for. So the first one is 5-minute epoxy. As its name implies, that once mixed, it takes about 5 minutes for that epoxy to do its chemical cure and actually harden. And it's a perfect place for taking dissimilar materials like this metal bolt and putting it in to, in this case, an MDF jig. And we can supply a really nice, heavy, solid adhesive that will never allow that bolt to move and make for a perfect jig. So the way that I like to use this is making my own little form. This is a piece of aluminum foil, and I'm just going to mix up enough of this. And you'll see when it comes out here, there's one side of this is a little bit more yellow than the other. That is the hardener. And on the opposite side is the resin, the clearer looking liquid. And equal amounts of those come out proportionately, so that when you mix this together, it will set in 5 minutes. The key to these is making sure that it's mixed well. So we just want to spend 10 or 20 seconds, maybe half a minute or so, just to make sure it's mixed completely. Because again, you're putting that hardener and resin together. And once we've got it in the consistency we want and an even color, then I can just coat this bolt and stick it in the hole. And that will harden well. Now I can also take the rest of this and kind of scoop it out like this and drizzle it on the top to make sure that I've got it all the way around. Or I can mix up enough of it so I can actually take this little foil and turn it into a funnel and shuttle the rest of that in there too. So either method works. Got just a little bit here, and the goal in this particular case is to get that even on the top. I like it just a little bit taller. It is going to shrink just a bit, and within 5 minutes that epoxy will harden to a point where you'll never get that bolt out of there. It's a permanent part of that jig, and it's a great adhesive to use, again, when putting dissimilar materials together. But that's 5-minute epoxy, something that's fairly fast. But there's another method of putting dissimilar materials together that I think you'll find interesting too. These are the two-part epoxies here, and they're actually both parts. We have the hardener on one side and the resin on the other. And by mixing those together, depending upon the proportions that you use, you can control the amount of cure time. In 5-minute epoxy, it's just 5 minutes. But depending upon how I mix those, I can get anywhere from 2 to 4 hours, maybe even up to 8 hours, depending upon how much time I need to get something set up. And the reason I like that is because we did a project a while back in the magazine where we took a piece of veneer like this. This is a burl veneer, and we affixed it to a piece of plexiglass. It gives a beautiful look to it where the light is on from behind it, which gives a nice little view, a nice little translucent view. And if there's no light from the back, it's just a very pretty look from the front. And to put a veneer onto plexiglass takes a special kind of adhesive, and that is epoxy. Now the preparation for this is fairly easy. The plexiglass itself is extremely durable, very, very hard, but extremely smooth. There's no place to get a bite in effect for this epoxy to hold. So what I did with this is I took that piece of plexiglass and I used 150 grit sandpaper on a random orbit sander. I just sanded this to really scratch up that material, so in effect I had tooth, and that epoxy will then sit in that tooth and allow for a real good bite. And by mixing these, I made a container large enough to pour them on here, spread it out, put my veneer on the top, and then clamp it. And what I get out of that is a pretty nice looking project. Let me show you the actual mechanics. So we have our hardener and our resin. The goal is to mix 1 part of hardener with 2 parts of resin. That gives me the setup time that I need, and again, that's in that 2 to 4 hour range. A lot of different ways to do this. When you buy this, you can actually buy it in a metered pump, where you can give a couple of squirts on one and 1 squirt of the other. I'm going to use something fairly simple. This is just a regular serving type spoon. And again, we're going to use 1 part of this hardener in a small mixing container. This may look a little bit odd, but when you mix epoxy together, the chemical reaction that forms as it's doing its thing generates an awful lot of heat. So we don't want that mixing to go into a styrofoam or a plastic container, because it can actually deform those or leak out through the sides. So I've got a small little metal container to do this with. So first we'll take just 1 part of hardener, like so. And then 2 parts of the resin. And of course we'd mix these up in whatever quantity you're looking for at the very end. And I use just a little wooden stir stick. Setup time is fairly prolonged, but also so should be the mixing time. It's very important to mix this thoroughly to make sure that your resin and hardener meet each other equally. So I've got now is a fairly liquid consistency as it comes out of here. This then would be poured onto that plexiglass that's been sanded, smoothed out. I like to do that with a business card. Lay my veneer on top, then put a couple of clamping cauls on the top and bottom, and I gave that about 4 hours to set. And after it did cure, this is what you get. About the only way that I can think of to affix a piece of veneer to plexiglass. It's a great project, a great technique, and this is the adhesive to use with it. The last glue in this grouping is called instant or CA glue. This is one here, this is medium. The viscosity of this is a little bit thicker than the thin, which is another one of the variations, and they also have a thick, a much heavier one. We've got medium here. It seems to work for most of the projects we do in the shop. And it's used in a lot of cases to take wood that's got a little bit of a bad spot to it and help solidify it, make it a little bit tighter together so that you continue to work with it. And I've got a few examples of that here. This is called Spalted Maple. And what you'll find on Spalted Maple is this beautiful coloring, but spalting sometimes when it goes a little bit too far creates an area called punk. It's a little bit softer wood. It's actually kind of destroyed the fiber of the wood. You can probably see it in here. The wood is just a little soft, little pieces actually kind of coming right out of here. If you want to use this piece of wood, I would hate to waste it because, again, of the coloring. One of the ways to keep that punk from getting any worse and to solidify the areas that are somewhat soft is to use a little bit of CA glue. So by drizzling that right in the opening, it'll set in and harden. And to speed up that process a little bit, we can use what's called an activator, and just a couple of quick hits with it sets that immediately. If the groove were real deep, a couple of coats could be added to it until you finally bring it up to the final surface. Turners like to use this quite a bit. Here's a crack that you see on the front of this small turning blank, and a bit of CA adhesive a couple of times through there will slowly build up the opening in there and solidify that crack so it doesn't split while they're trying to turn it. If the crack were real large, like it was here, this is an indication of where I may want to use epoxy, something a little bit more coverage. I have another spot like that here too on the top of this blank. There's also a very large hole, which is also punky. But in this case, it would take an awful lot of CA in that So if I wanted to fix that somewhat punky spot, I would use a piece of tape like this as a dam across the front. So when I'm putting epoxy in there, it'll flow over the surface, but it won't leak down over the front. It actually works well. And one of the last places that I think you'll find the use of this, and yet actually you'll probably use it more often for this than anything else, is on this particular piece of pine. There's a knot here, and it's got an exposure on both the face and on the edge. And over time, drying conditions will probably make that knot get a little bit looser or maybe even fall out. Again, a little bit of CA glue in this spot. First on one edge like this, and again with a spritz or two of hardener, and then a couple drops on this edge with that same spritz. Hardens that up. That knot will never fall out of there, and you can machine that just the way you would normally. I normally like to put on the CA glue just a little bit thick. Once it does harden, sand it off till it's even with the surface. But now that's a very, very solid knot. It won't come out of that wood, and it works really well. CA glue has got an awful lot of uses, and you'll find more the more often you use it. But these are 3 alternatives to a problem that are fixed by CA glue, and I think it's a good thing to have in your shop. Well, hopefully we've given you a pretty good idea about how to take that wild selection of glue that you originally saw and find the appropriate uses for it. Giving you a lot of examples here, and I'm sure that you're going to find many more in your shop. Glue is the thing that holds your projects together. Picking the right one is really what it takes.